The United States Treasury Secretary just resigned on live television, looked directly into the camera, and declared that the order he was handed would destroy the American dollar. A total of 14 senior Treasury and Federal Reserve officials have now either resigned, been terminated, or publicly refused directives in the past 72 hours, marking the most catastrophic collapse of financial leadership in American history, triggered by a single executive order that economists from both parties are calling a direct threat to the global reserve currency status of the United States dollar. And this isn't a policy disagreement or routine cabinet turnover. This is the man who manages $34 trillion in national debt and controls the machinery of American economic power, standing up on national television, refusing a direct presidential order, and telling 330 million Americans that if this order is signed, the dollar will collapse. Hit that subscribe button right now because you won't want to miss any of the videos I release. So, what triggered this unprecedented act of public defiance? According to multiple sources with direct knowledge of the situation, Treasury Secretary Robert Harmon received a classified executive directive on the morning of March 4th instructing the Treasury Department to instruct the Federal Reserve to purchase an additional $2.3 trillion in government bonds over 90 days, while simultaneously freezing interest rate adjustments and ordering the suspension of standard debt ceiling protocols. Sources familiar with the directive say it was drafted not by Treasury economists, but by a small team of political advisors at the White House, and that it bypassed the standard interagency review process entirely. This isn't just another dispute over fiscal policy or a disagreement about interest rates. Constitutional scholars and former Fed chairs are calling this the most direct assault on central bank independence since the institution was created in 1913. And believe me, when a sitting Treasury Secretary resigns in real time on live television, rather than implement a presidential directive, something has fractured at the very foundation of American economic governance. Here's the full picture of what's been unfolding. Tensions between the White House and the Treasury Department had been simmering since early February, when the Council of Economic Advisors began warning internally that proposed spending directives were structurally incompatible with maintaining dollar credibility in international bond markets. Those warnings, according to sources inside the Treasury, were dismissed at the White House level. But everything exploded on the afternoon of March 5th, when Secretary Harmon appeared on CNBC for what was scheduled as a routine interview about quarterly economic projections. The interview, conducted live at Treasury Department headquarters by anchor Sarah Chen, began normally. Harmon appeared composed. The first 6 minutes covered standard territory. Then Chen asked about reports of a classified executive directive. The room changed. According to producers present in the studio, Harmon paused for nearly 4 seconds, looked at the camera, and removed his prepared notes from the desk in front of him. He folded them carefully. Then he spoke. I received an order this morning that I cannot in good conscience implement. I have served 4 administrations across both parties. I have implemented policies I disagreed with. But this order, if executed, will trigger a sovereign debt confidence crisis. Foreign central banks will begin exiting dollar-denominated reserves. The implications for every American who holds savings, who has a mortgage, who depends on the purchasing power of this currency are catastrophic. I will not sign this order. He then stood, removed his lapel microphone, placed it on the desk, and walked off camera. This wasn't a policy dispute or a resignation letter sent quietly to the White House. This was the nation's top financial officer declaring on live television that the dollar itself is in jeopardy. Smash that like button if this is making sense so far. Here's where it really gets serious. Within 90 minutes of Harmon's resignation airing on live television, Deputy Treasury Secretary Linda Castellano called an emergency convening of the Treasury's Senior Leadership Council in the third-floor secure conference room at 1500 Pennsylvania Avenue. According to staffers who were present in the adjacent corridor, 11 senior officials attended, including Undersecretary for Domestic Finance Marcus Webb, Assistant Secretary for Economic Policy Dr. James Okafor, Office of Debt Management Director Patricia Lund, Senior Advisor to the Secretary Thomas Briggs, and 4 additional Deputy Assistant Secretaries. The meeting lasted 2 hours and 12 minutes. What happened inside, according to multiple officials who later spoke on condition of anonymity, was described as the most consequential gathering of Treasury leadership since the 2008 financial crisis. Castellano reportedly began the meeting by stating plainly, her voice measured but her hands visibly shaking according to those present. We have a legal obligation to implement lawful executive directives. We also have a professional obligation not to participate in actions we believe will cause systemic financial harm. Every person in this room needs to understand what they are being asked to do and make their own decision. History will not forget how we act in the next 24 hours. The room fell silent. Undersecretary Marcus Webb, who has served 6 years at Treasury and was considered a likely successor to Harmon, reportedly stood and said, his voice steady according to witnesses, "Secretary Harmon is right. I've worked through policy disagreements before. I've implemented directives I thought were wrong, but what we are being asked to do here is not a policy choice. The bond market models don't lie. If we execute this order, foreign central bank selling begins within 72 hours. That's not a political opinion. That's a mathematical certainty. I won't sign it either." According to officials present, Webb's statement changed the dynamic of the room immediately. Dr. James Okafor, who chairs the Treasury's internal economic modeling team and whose projections had been circulated to senior staff the previous evening, reportedly added, "The models are unambiguous. There are 3 separate scenarios we ran, and in every single one, dollar reserve outflows begin within the quarter. If we don't push back now, we are complicit in what happens to ordinary American savings." Drop a comment right now if you saw this coming. I read every single one. Now things get absolutely explosive. By 9:00 p.m. that evening, 6 of the 11 officials who attended the emergency council meeting had submitted formal letters of resignation to the White House. An extraordinary development given that Treasury officials rarely resign en masse and almost never in public coordination. But according to Deputy Secretary Castellano, who released a brief public statement, "We are not resigning out of partisanship. We are resigning because we believe the directive we have been given is incompatible with our sworn obligation to maintain the financial stability of the United States." The resignation letters, which were obtained by the Wall Street Journal and published at 11:45 p.m., contained 2 formal objections. Objection 1 alleged procedural illegality, specifically arguing that the directive violated the Federal Reserve Act of 1913 by attempting to use Treasury authority to effectively direct monetary policy in a manner that bypasses the Federal Open Market Committee's independent mandate. Objection 2, alleged systemic risk, charging that the directive, as written, would require Treasury to execute bond purchases at a scale that the existing secondary market cannot absorb without triggering a price collapse, which would directly impair the dollar's reserve currency status. But the truly devastating element of the resignations was not the legal arguments, it was the supporting documentation. The letters referenced internal Treasury modeling reports, marked sensitive but not classified, projecting that execution of the directive would result in a 12 to 18% decline in dollar purchasing power within 18 months, a 340 basis point spike in 10-year Treasury yields, and an estimated $1.7 trillion outflow from dollar-denominated foreign reserves within 12 months. One paragraph in Dr. Okafor's letter stated, "On March 3, 2025, our internal modeling division completed Scenario Analysis Report 2025-7, which examined the projected impact of the proposed bond purchase program on sovereign debt confidence metrics. The conclusion of that report, which was transmitted to the White House on March 4th and acknowledged as received, states unambiguously that the proposal will trigger a confidence crisis in the dollar's reserve currency status within 1 fiscal quarter. This moved shockwaves through Washington and the financial world simultaneously. When 6 senior Treasury officials resign in a single evening citing internal government models that project a collapse in dollar purchasing power, every foreign central bank on the planet is reading those resignation letters. This isn't the first time the dollar's reserve currency status has faced pressure. During the 2008 financial crisis, questions about dollar stability circulated through international markets. But Federal Reserve independence held. The institutional framework functioned. Foreign governments maintained their dollar holdings because they trusted the institutional machinery remained intact. Then came the 2011 debt ceiling crisis. Credit agencies downgraded United States sovereign debt for the first time in history. Markets shook, but Treasury and the Fed coordinated, institutional credibility was maintained, and the dollar held its position. Now it's completely different. This crisis is not driven by market forces or political gridlock. It is driven by a direct executive order to override the institutional independence that gives the dollar its value. The evidence at issue involves internal government projections, not outside criticism. The officials resigning are not political opponents. They are career financial administrators from both parties who built their careers managing the very systems now being directed to act against their own integrity, and 6 have already resigned, with multiple more considering joining. The pattern is clear. Dollar stability has survived previous crises through institutional independence. But when the directive to abandon that independence comes from inside the executive branch itself, even institutional loyalty has limits. Subscribe immediately if you haven't yet. This content doesn't exist anywhere else. So what exactly triggered this mass institutional revolt? According to officials who have now spoken publicly and economists who have reviewed the available documentation, 3 specific pieces of evidence proved decisive. First, the internal Treasury modeling report. The Treasury's own economic modeling division presented senior leadership with Scenario Analysis Report 2025-7 on March 3rd, a document that ran 3 separate projections of what would happen if the directive were implemented. According to Dr. Angela Price, former deputy director of the Congressional Budget Office and current senior fellow at the Brookings Institution, who reviewed portions of the report after it was leaked, what the model shows is not ambiguous. It projects a sequence of events that any first-year economics graduate student would recognize as a confidence spiral. The numbers are not close. In every scenario, the outcome is severe dollar devaluation. The report reportedly identified specific trigger mechanisms across 11 separate foreign central bank portfolios that would begin automatic rebalancing within 72 hours of the directive's execution. Second, Federal Reserve Board internal communications. Treasury officials also had access to Federal Reserve Board communications, indicating that Fed leadership had explicitly communicated to the White House that the directive constituted an attempt to direct monetary policy in violation of the Fed's statutory independence. According to Senator Elizabeth Warren, who chairs the Senate Banking Committee and has been briefed on the situation, the Federal Reserve communicated clearly and in writing that this directive was not something they could accommodate within their statutory mandate. The White House received that communication and sent the directive anyway. That sequence of events tells you everything. The communications reportedly included a formal legal opinion from the Fed's general counsel stating that Treasury compliance with the directive would require the Fed to either participate in what it considered a violation of its charter or publicly refuse, creating a constitutional confrontation with no good resolution. Here's the absolute kicker. The third piece of evidence involves the timeline of the directive itself. An internal White House communications log, portions of which were provided to the Senate Banking Committee, shows that Scenario Analysis Report 2025-7 was transmitted to the White House on March 4th at 8:47 a.m. and was acknowledged as received by the White House Chief of Staff's office at 9:12 a.m. The executive directive ordering Treasury to proceed was issued at 10:33 a.m. That same morning, less than 90 minutes after the White House received a modeling report projecting catastrophic consequences, one source with direct knowledge of the timeline, quoted anonymously in the Washington Post, stated that the directive was issued not despite the modeling report, but after it. The people who drafted it saw exactly what the Treasury economists projected and sent the order anyway. Don't go anywhere. The most explosive part is coming next. And here's what should alarm everyone, regardless of political affiliation. This isn't just about Secretary Harmon or this specific executive order. If a president can direct the Treasury to execute financial actions that the Treasury's own economists project will destroy dollar purchasing power, and do so after receiving those projections in writing without facing any institutional consequence, then the independence of every financial institution in America has effectively become optional. Once that precedent is established, future administrations of either party will understand that the Federal Reserve's independence, the Treasury's analytical integrity, and the institutional frameworks that make the dollar the world's reserve currency are all negotiable based on political convenience. The dollar doesn't hold its global position because of geography or military power alone. It holds that position because the world trusts that the institutions managing it cannot be overridden by a single executive decision. That trust, once lost, does not return quickly. The implications for every American's mortgage rate, savings account, and retirement fund are not abstract. They are direct, measurable, and permanent. This puts the administration in an absolutely impossible political and legal position. On one side, the White House faces a mass resignation of its own Treasury leadership backed by documented internal modeling that projects catastrophic economic consequences, meaning the resignation rationale cannot be dismissed as political opposition. On the other side, the administration confronts a situation where the Federal Reserve has formally communicated that compliance with the directive would require it to act outside its statutory mandate. And here's the impossible bind. If the White House claims Secretary Harmon misrepresented the modeling report, they directly contradict a document that is now in the possession of the Senate Banking Committee and has been partially published by the Wall Street Journal. If the administration insists the directive is economically sound and replaces the resigned officials with people willing to implement it, they face a Federal Reserve that has already communicated in writing that it cannot accommodate the action, triggering a public constitutional confrontation between two branches of economic authority. If the White House claims presidential authority over Treasury operations supersedes the Fed's independent mandate, they undermine the very legal foundation that grants Treasury securities their sovereign credibility in international markets, which is the mechanism by which the dollar maintains its reserve currency status. There's no defense strategy that addresses all three pieces of evidence simultaneously. Constitutional scholars and former officials are calling this the most serious threat to dollar reserve currency status in the post-Bretton Woods era. Dr. Carmen Reinhart, former chief economist of the World Bank and Harvard Kennedy School professor of the international financial system, stated on Bloomberg television that reserve currency status is not a natural phenomenon. It is an institutional achievement. It rests on the credibility of the systems managing it. When the world watches 6 senior Treasury officials resign in a single evening because they believe an executive directive will damage the dollar, the world's foreign exchange reserve managers are watching the same thing. They do not need to wait for the directive to be implemented. The signal itself is already moving markets. Former Federal Reserve Chair Janet Yellen, who served as Treasury Secretary under the Biden administration, told NPR that central bank independence exists for exactly this moment. When political directives conflict with monetary stability, the institutional firewall must hold. What we are watching in real time is a test of whether that firewall is structural or merely conventional. Even Lawrence Kudlow, former director of the National Economic Council under President Trump and longtime proponent of executive economic authority, published a statement on Fox Business acknowledging that there is a meaningful distinction between a president directing fiscal priorities and a president directing the mechanisms of monetary credibility. The former is legitimate executive authority. The latter endangers every American who holds dollars. Do me a favor and slam that like button because it genuinely helps this video reach more people. So, let's break down what this means. First, immediate market instability. Bond markets do not wait for political situations to resolve. The 10-year Treasury yield moved 47 basis points in the 18 hours following Harmon's resignation. Foreign exchange desks at major international banks have reported increased dollar selling pressure as of early morning trading in Tokyo and London. The dollar index dropped 1.8% overnight. These are not large numbers in absolute terms, but the direction is the signal. When Treasury yields rise because markets question institutional integrity rather than economic growth, the dynamic is fundamentally different from normal rate cycles. Second, massive institutional paralysis at the highest levels of financial governance. The Treasury Department is currently operating without its top 3 confirmed officials. The Federal Reserve has communicated formally that it cannot accommodate the directive as written. Financial markets are watching a real-time confrontation between executive authority and institutional independence, with no established precedent for resolution. Foreign governments holding roughly $7.6 trillion in U.S. Treasury securities are actively calculating whether the institutional framework they trusted when they purchased those securities still exists. Third, precedent implications that extend far beyond this administration. If the directive is ultimately implemented over Treasury officials' objections and over the Federal Reserve's formal communication of statutory conflict, it will establish that the independence of America's financial institutions is subject to override by executive order. Every future administration of either party will inherit that precedent. International bond markets will price American sovereign debt differently. The cost of every dollar borrowed by the United States government will reflect the permanent addition of institutional risk. Drop a comment below with your thoughts. I'm genuinely curious to see your perspective. But beyond immediate market impact, this represents a test of whether the institutional architecture that has sustained American economic leadership since 1944 can still function as designed. The Federal Reserve Act and the Treasury's institutional independence were not created as partisan constructs. They were created to insulate the management of currency and debt from exactly the kind of short-term political pressure that produces long-term monetary damage. If the system holds, Treasury officials who refuse unlawful directives are protected, the Federal Reserve's independence is reaffirmed, and the dollar's institutional credibility survives this episode. If the system fails, if the directive is implemented over every institutional objection, it demonstrates that every protection built into the financial architecture is conditional on a political decision to respect it. This scenario is causing absolute pandemonium within financial markets, the Senate Banking Committee, and among foreign central banks. Reports indicate the Federal Reserve Board of Governors has been in emergency session since Tuesday evening, attempting to determine its legal options. The Senate Banking Committee has convened an emergency hearing scheduled for Thursday. The International Monetary Fund has issued a formal statement expressing concern about what it termed institutional governance uncertainty in a systemically significant economy. The White House faces an impossible situation. Move forward with implementation and trigger a Federal Reserve confrontation. Back down and acknowledge the directive was improperly conceived. There is no middle path. Meanwhile, the administration is in crisis mode. Reports indicate the president has been meeting with a small team of economic advisors around the clock, and early public statements characterized Harmon's resignation as a politically motivated act by a disloyal official. But a poll conducted by Reuters and Ipsos in the 24 hours after Harmon's live resignation shows that 67% of Americans believe Congress should investigate whether the directive threatens the dollar's stability, including 41% of self-identified Republicans. Things escalated further when the president addressed the media Wednesday afternoon. The president denied that the directive posed any risk to the dollar, characterized the resigning officials as part of a deep state effort to undermine economic policy, and announced the appointment of a new acting Treasury Secretary. But economists and legal scholars immediately noted that the president did not address the specific contents of Scenario Analysis Report 2025-7, the Federal Reserve's formal written communication, or the internal timeline showing the directive was issued after the modeling report was received. Stay with me because what comes next will completely change your understanding of where this leads. Here's what makes the administration's position so precarious and its response so strategically disastrous. By characterizing the resigning Treasury officials as politically motivated actors, the White House is undermining the credibility of the very institution it still needs to function. Treasury's ability to issue sovereign debt, manage dollar liquidity operations, and maintain relationships with foreign central banks depends entirely on the world believing that Treasury officials act on professional and legal obligation, not political instruction. Every time the White House characterizes Treasury professionals as partisan operatives, it reinforces exactly the narrative that Foreign Reserve managers are now incorporating into their risk models. Political analyst Elaine Kamarck, senior fellow at the Brookings Institution and former Clinton White House official, observed that the White House communication strategy appears to be treating this as a political story when it is fundamentally a credibility story. Those require completely different responses. The political playbook of attacking the messenger makes the credibility problem dramatically worse, not better. Former Treasury official and Columbia University professor Adam Posen noted that the pattern we are watching, attacking rather than addressing, dismissing institutional concerns as political, is precisely the behavior that causes foreign bondholders to begin reassigning risk. They are not watching who wins the political argument. They are watching whether institutional processes are respected. This goes far beyond one executive order or one administration. It is about whether the United States can maintain the institutional credibility that underlies the dollar's global reserve currency status. If an administration can override Treasury and pressure the Federal Reserve without consequence, every future leader of either party understands the template exists. The dollar's premium in international markets, which allows the United States to borrow at lower rates than any other nation, reflects institutional trust that took 80 years to build. If this blows your mind, hit that like button right now. Here's where things stand right now. 6 senior Treasury officials have resigned rather than implement an executive directive they believe will damage the dollar. The Federal Reserve has formally communicated that the directive conflicts with its statutory independence. Internal government modeling projects a 12 to 18% decline in dollar purchasing power if the directive is executed. The Senate Banking Committee has convened emergency hearings. International markets have already begun moving in the direction that Treasury economists projected, and the entire institutional architecture that has made the dollar the world's reserve currency faces a test it was never formally designed to face, because every designer of that architecture assumed the executive branch would not directly challenge it. This isn't market volatility or economic cycle fluctuation. This is the closest the dollar's institutional credibility has come to a direct executive threat since the United States abandoned the gold standard in 1971, and the consequences of that decision took decades to fully manifest. When the Treasury Secretary resigns on live television rather than implement a presidential directive, when 6 senior Treasury officials follow within hours citing internal models projecting catastrophic dollar devaluation, when the Federal Reserve formally communicates in writing that it cannot accommodate the directive within its legal mandate, the institutional system is being tested in ways it has not faced since its creation. Keep an extremely close eye on this story, because what happens in the coming days will determine not just the fate of this specific directive, but whether the institutional independence that makes American sovereign debt the world's safest asset still exists. Treasury must now either find officials willing to implement the directive or watch the confrontation with the Federal Reserve become fully public. The administration's survival depends on convincing markets and foreign governments that institutional credibility remains intact. But its strategy of attacking the officials who resigned appears to be accelerating exactly the market signal those officials warned about. Before we go any further, smash that subscribe button so you never miss content like this, because this constitutional and financial crisis is unfolding in real time and represents the most serious threat to the dollar's institutional foundation in modern American history. Here's where things stand right now. 6 senior Treasury officials resigned in a single evening rather than implement a directive their own modeling projects will damage the dollar. The evidence they cited is not partisan commentary. It is internal government analysis transmitted to the White House before the directive was issued. The administration's response of dismissing the resignations as politically motivated is accelerating the very market concern those officials identified. The Senate Banking Committee, the Federal Reserve Board of Governors, and foreign central banks holding $7.6 trillion in U.S. Treasuries are all watching the same sequence of events and drawing their own conclusions. This isn't a cabinet reshuffle or a policy disagreement. This is the most serious test of the institutional framework protecting the dollar's reserve currency status that this generation of financial officials has ever faced. The stakes have never been higher for the dollar as a global institution. The evidence has never been more concrete and internally documented, and the constitutional and financial crisis has never been more immediate. Pause for a second and hit that like button if you're finding value in this coverage.